add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often, if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
Issues of systemic exclusion in the tech industry, frankly, just haven't been solved. And there isn't really a silver bullet to solve them.
Ladies and gentlemen, hiring on all cylinders is back to the airwaves, this time without the ruckus and rabble of the HR tech conference space in the background. Don't fret, as we'll be revisiting our live-streamed podcast extraordinaire soon enough. And did I say we?
Hello, Sean. I think you did say we.
I think that qualifies as one of the cheesiest intros I've ever written. Here, I thought our listeners would have to sit through an entire podcast with only my dreary voice to keep them company. Folks, I'm glad to say we have Britt Ryan by my side yet again.
Yoo-hoo! I would not have it any other way.
It seems like forever ago we were talking about all things HR tech, but the space that we play in seems to keep moving along. In fact, just this week, a large development came our way from our iPhone 10 toting neighbors to the south.
Having Denise Young-Smith, the VP of Diversity at Apple, depart after only joining in May kind of caused a stir.
Yeah, you could say that. Luckily, the impact that diversity is having on organizations is even more prevalent than it was a year ago and even as close as yesterday. That's why we're incredibly excited to welcome Aubrey Blanche to the podcast.
Hi, Aubrey.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we are super excited to have you. So as the head of diversity and inclusion at Atlassian, we understand that that is a newer role, not only at Atlassian, but across the board. It seems that it's become an area of great attention and great focus as we look at, not only tech companies, but for the sake of this conversation, specifically to tech in the Bay Area. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your thoughts in terms of companies creating the role, what it's like to be the head of D&I at a company, what it's like for you particularly at Atlassian, and maybe also just fill us in a little bit on who Atlassian is.
Absolutely. So to sort of start high level, Atlassian is an Australian software company that's focused on collaboration specifically for teams. So a lot of people have heard of some of our products, things like Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, Trello, HipChat, and our newest product, which just launched this fall, Stride. But fundamentally, what Atlassian's mission is to unleash the potential in every team. And so we're constantly thinking about ways that we can drive greater collaboration, both through our tools, but also through practices. And for us, that means that diversity and inclusion is pretty central to what we do, because we know that the best, most effective teams are both diverse and create an environment where everyone feels like they're included and like they can participate. But zooming out a little bit, I think that this role in particular, for me, I like to say that my job is something that spans the entire company. So it spans the talent lifecycle, everything from advising on our investments in STEM education to really rethinking the way that we recruit people, to thinking about how we develop and retain people internally, and then how we continue to scale our culture as we continue to be in sort of this hyper growth mode that we've been in since our IPO in 2015. And I think that that's the core mandate for these diversity and inclusion roles that you're starting to see pop up in the tech industry. But what I'm seeing overall is that there's a lot of movement in this space. So you see a lot of people coming into these roles. You see some people leaving them. And to me, I'll be honest that I don't find it super surprising.
Why is that?
Because issues of systemic exclusion in the tech industry, frankly, just haven't been solved. And there isn't really a silver bullet to solve them. So we're all constantly learning on the job, right? Borrowing from best practices. At Atlassian, we like to say that we embrace progress over perfection, and that it's really about taking an iterative process to creating equity and creating inclusion. And so I think the reason that you see this movement is because companies are experimenting with different types of leaders in these roles. If you look at a lot of the high growth tech companies, you look at Facebook and Twitter and Airbnb, Atlassian, Yelp, Twilio recently brought on a head of D&I. you'll see that there's not actually a lot that those people have in common in terms of their work experience before they came to the roles. So there's an incredible diversity of experience that people are bringing into those jobs. And a lot of it depends on what the specific company needs and where their growth areas are in terms of inclusion, which is, I think, an interesting piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense that a head of diversity and inclusion come from diverse backgrounds. Like, I guess that makes sense.
Absolutely. And so for me, I guess to answer the original question a little bit, I always thought that I had a pretty unorthodox sort of career path, if you will. So I originally was working on a degree in journalism and worked as a reporter, but I eventually was working on a graduate degree in political science and then worked in business development before transitioning laterally into diversity and inclusion. And my background really informs the way that Atlassian has approached D&I. So we've taken a very empirical, sort of data-informed approach, relying a lot on social science and social science methodologies to try to push for progress. And a lot of that is because that sort of method and that background really resonated with our culture and our business and the folks in it. And so that means that it was likely to be a more of an effective approach than something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you've been a strong advocate for data-driven recruiting processes, but you've also been critical of some of the ways organizations misuse that data for D&I. Do you think that data can be a double-edged sword in this sense?
Absolutely. And I think there's sort of two reasons. So first, I think that corporate diversity reporting is actually pretty broken. I love that companies are doing it, and I like to think of this sort of release of your corporate statistics as the V1 of diversity reporting. But something that Atlassian has tried to do is we've actually tried to develop better metrics for measuring diversity. And what I mean by that is that we actually measure diversity at the team level. If you want to see what that looks like, you can check it out at atlassian.com/diversity. But the reason that I'm really passionate about this is because corporate level representation doesn't actually measure diversity. It just measures representation. Or to put it a different way, it doesn't matter if 50% of your company identifies as female, for example, if all of the women are in marketing and HR. It means that people aren't experiencing the diversity of perspectives in their day-to-day work.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because we even talk about that, there are areas that definitely attract more women. And the flip side of that sometimes is that I'm on a predominantly female team, and we'll talk about the fact that, when we look to hire for diversity, we are looking to not hire a woman. Of course, we always want to get the best candidate for the job, but we love the idea of having different thoughts on our team. So it can swing both ways.
Absolutely. And I think there's another piece of the puzzle which you've hinted at, which is that by looking at diversity at the team level, what you can actually do is create more targeted recruiting strategies to help you build more balanced teams.
Yeah.
So at Atlassian, we think about that. How do we bring our teams into balance? And that can mean something very different. For example, some parts of your organization might not have the perspectives of people of color on them, or veterans, or people with disabilities. Or maybe it's people over 40, because we know that ageism is a pretty big deal in tech.
Yeah.
But in some organizations, it may actually be focusing on that recruiting of people who are sort of traditionally underrepresented. So women, people of color, people with intersectional minority identities. And so that's been something that's really powerful for us in terms of not just driving recruiting, but also driving retention, is by having that deeper insight. Mm-hmm. There's also a second piece to get to your question about data being a double-edged sword, which is that a lot of companies focus exclusively on diversity because it's something that's easy to count in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Right?
Counting people is simple, but they often forget the second part. So I say that there's a reason I have an ampersand in my job title, but inclusion is just hard to measure, right? Because it's a subjective feeling of being psychologically safe, of feeling like you belong on your team. And so some companies, because they can't measure it with the same specificity that they can diversity, they get nervous about investing in it, when you shouldn't do that. You just need to rely on a broader set of data to help you to understand what the state of inclusion is at your company. in particular parts of the org or even on specific teams.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funny thing is, right, not the fear of investing in inclusion. By investing in inclusion, it makes it that much more easy to recruit for diversity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, what I see is, and I think anyone, myself included, who comes from an underrepresented or marginalized background in tech, we know that we rely on things like the Whisper network a lot more than some of our majority group peers. And you see a lot of companies investing in sort of the branding piece, right? Making sure that they're getting that employer value proposition, that brand marketing out there about the fact that they value diversity and they want to build an inclusive culture. But that also needs to be coupled with sort of the folks who are already in your organization. They're going to be your best brand advocates. And so creating an amazing environment for them can be an incredible recruiting tool that I think is often underutilized.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about recruiting, I think this is so interesting. And, you know, of course, it's my wheelhouse. So selfishly, I want to ask the question.
Yeah.
But, you know, what's so interesting to me is like you guys have done this incredible job, right? You boosted your female tech hires by 80% in the past year. And I think that that's so interesting. And there are a couple of things for me when I look at that. Like one is, okay, so how did you do it? But I also, for me, when I think about how to increase diversity, how to get your company to be more inclusive, there's also sort of these baby steps, right? So like 80% of what? And then what's the goal for the next year? And like, how do you continue to build since so many of us are now playing catch up? You know, what are the things that you think are really important for that?
Absolutely. So I'll quickly tell you how we did it. The short answer is with science. The slightly longer answer is that, right, and I'm like, I'm a scientist, but
Bill
I'm
and I,
an HR.
the science guy, or
exactly.
Aubrey, the science girl.
Yes, I'm totally into it. But a lot of what we did, so I partner really closely with our recruiting team. So they're some of my best partners. And one of the things that we talk about is that my job is to help design a recruiting process that is efficient, accurate, and objective as possible. And if we do that, if we succeed at that, we will get diversity on the other side of it. So that's really important because people think that there's this myth that you have to lower the bar, when in fact we say that diversity is the result of us holding ourselves to the highest standards. So what we did is we looked at our interview process. We switched to structured behavioral interviewing, which research shows is most predictive of candidates' on-the-job performance.
Definitely.
So again, that's just a good thing. Mm-hmm. We also got rid of the concept of culture fit from our hiring process.
Yep. Yeah.
Which is a super popular term that is basically just an intractable morass of unconscious bias.
Wow, that was poetic.
I know. I was like, wow, those were SAT words.
Yes. I told you, I talk like a dictionary occasionally, a little overly academic at times. But what we did is we actually replaced it with something that we call values fit. And so this was the process of a lot of thought and work because Atlassian has 5 corporate values. So things like open company, no bullshit, build with heart and balance, don't F the customer, play as a team, and be the change you seek. And we sat down and we thought about what behaviors those led to. Things like people have demonstrated empathy for their colleagues who are willing to go out of their way to help them. People who put the customer's needs before the short-term business interests, because we know that that will pay dividends in the long term. People who are excited to work transparently and openly. Those types of things are really important to us. And so we designed an interview that actually helped us assess whether people have natural inclinations towards those things. And we were very careful to design it so that it doesn't have to come from an experience working in tech. So someone could demonstrate their ability to make smart trade-offs, telling us about a complicated software project they led, or maybe it's about coordinating getting their 3 kids to soccer practice and school and home in time for bed. So again, trying to be really broad about the folks who we're bringing in and making sure that everyone has a chance to be successful in our process. Mm-hmm. And then on the brand side, we obviously overhauled our branding to make sure that it was welcoming to everyone. So obvious things like updating your photos, but more subtle things. like ensuring that we were actually putting on our careers page that in addition to benefits like happy hour and, beer on tap, we also offer comprehensive health insurance, emergency backup childcare, 401k matching, and really, really pride ourselves on work-life balance.
I love all of that. And I have to tell you, was looking at Sean over here, and I was kind of wondering if he could see my halo, because I feel so proud that I can say that Entello's doing these things. And so I also feel like we're in really good company with you. So thanks for all of those best practices.
Yes.
So here's another question for you. And I'm curious about this because, you guys are a global company. We're here in the Bay Area, and this is something that I struggle with, and I'm sure a lot of other people who are recruiting leaders, when you're thinking about diversity, the Census Bureau says that in the Bay Area, the technology pool that we fish from is 25% female. And so I'm always thinking about, how do we have this diverse and inclusive environment when the candidate pool is not going to permit for us to be at where we want our ideal state to be? And so what does that look like, for you at Atlassian, and what are your recommendations, for other companies who would love nothing more than to have a, rich, diverse, inclusive environment, but also struggle with the fact that they may not actually have access to that talent?
Absolutely. I think this is a very real challenge. So we are a global company. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia. And if anyone has tried to do tech hiring in Sydney, what you'll know is that there are less people in Australia than in the US, which is not a particularly prescient insight. But also that the proportion of people getting technical degrees is lower. And worse still, the proportion of women getting those technical degrees is even lower than in the US. So it's about 13%. And so absolutely, there's a constrained talent pipeline. But what I've found is that by building a compelling culture, companies who are doing that will actually be able to better utilize the talent that's currently existing. So that's sort of step one, is creating a place where you're going to get an overshare of that talent because they want to go there, because there's exciting work for them to do in an environment where they feel like they can thrive. I think we've proved also that, and the statistics would support this, that on average, someone from an underrepresented group is actually likely more talented than the average member of a well-represented group. And it's not because of anything innate to those groups, but rather because the somewhat lower performers, I say that in quotation marks, from that underrepresented group have likely been selected out by the time they get to the workforce. And so we saw this, for example, this year with our graduate hiring. So we employed the exact techniques I talked about earlier to build our graduate recruiting process. And this year, 57% of our graduates in technical roles identified as women. And then 1/3 of our technical interns in the US identified as Black or Hispanic.
That's fabulous.
I love that. That's such a critical thing too. I think the opportunities that we have to engage and inspire people who are coming up in their careers is so meaningful. And for them to find that they're in an environment where, they're supported and they're recognized and celebrated is fantastic. Are there, I'm curious, are there other companies, for you, like, who have been your role models as you've come up in your career and when you think about other companies who are doing this well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a huge fan of the way Pinterest is approaching this problem as well. They sort of share this philosophy with us around really embedding their practices in social science and sort of testing to see what works in their environment, because that's something that people often don't think about in terms of D&I, is that there are all of these best practice recommendations, but they have differing levels of empirical support. And just because something worked at one company doesn't necessarily mean it'll work at another. And so I think we're all really well served by that. I also really respect that Pinterest, like Atlassian, has tried to take a really authentic and transparent approach to their progress. If you look at their numbers, they're definitely one of the leading companies in the industry in terms of representation, but they're also very open about sharing their learnings about what initiatives didn't work or what goals they didn't hit. And we've done that as well, because what I've seen that I think is long-term detrimental is that this is an unsolved problem, and it's not one that's going to get solved in a year. And so the industry is better for companies being able to share practices that were effective and that weren't, because that means, like you said, for companies coming up that might have limited resources, they can make sure to skip the stuff that doesn't work and get right to trying something new that might keep innovating on this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And frankly, the note that you had about various techniques and best practices having varying levels of empirical support, I think goes back to what you were talking about, that the head of D&I position is one that is incredibly iterative, because someone might come with a set of experiences at one company and try to bring that same set that might have support in that previous situation, but maybe at this new company, it won't quite suss out the same way. And so I think that goes back and supports exactly what you were mentioning earlier.
Absolutely. I can think of a personal example from Atlassian that seems really funny in hindsight, and is important to me personally. So Atlassian is an Australian company, as I said, and I'm a Latina woman in tech. And so when I started, I was really excited to start a lot of discussions around racial equity and things like that. But I very quickly realized that most of our employees were based outside of the United States. And so they actually didn't even have a fundamental model for what race means and how it's constructed in American society. And so it actually caused me to be more thoughtful about the blind spots in my own perspective, right? Because as an American, I come with a certain set of experiences and perspectives that may not resonate as much.
Yeah.
And so it's taken the course of us sort of pushing that dialogue slowly to educate folks outside of the U.S. about the particular challenges that their Black or Hispanic coworkers might face. But that particular learning has been really valuable, because it means that for our American Atlassians, they also have to come with an open mind and sort of open ears about the challenges that other employees in other geographies might face, or specifically what diversity even means in different geographies.
Yeah, I mean, even something as small as the difference between, when we first started talking about the diversity filter that we were building, we're an international product. And so thinking about the title African American doesn't apply. Like, you have to realize that every geography, every culture, like you're talking about, has their own set of diversity that they need to focus on to make their own environment inclusive and rich in backgrounds. So that's fascinating, and actually kind of gives me a nice little segue into the next question that I would love to ask, which is actually about hiring technologies. And I'm just kind of curious, to what degree do you think the hiring technologies that organizations invest in drives their actual hiring outcomes?
Yeah, so I think that technology can play an incredibly important part in this, but that it is not the solution. And what I mean by that is that I think technology is an incredible accelerator of things that are already moving, but the technology applied to a problem without a thoughtful strategy about why you're doing it and how you'll use it means that it won't be effective. And that's really important to me as someone who's sort of come in through enterprise software and moved into sort of a people space, that we're always thinking about technology that we're using and specifically why we're using it. So for me, I think the hiring technologies are amazing. Things like better sourcing is so incredibly important. And that's something where I've seen technology really take hold and really be an incredible boon to the industry. Obviously, Intello and lots of other things on the market, things like Dropwell, right? Which is sort of using technology to bring together a community of professionals of color who might have been outside sort of the traditional sourcing window of a lot of these tech companies, but would be really valuable for them to have internally. And so I think it's just that for D&I leaders or HR leaders in general, making sure that they're buying the right technologies to solve the problem that they have.
Yeah. And I mean, you're also talking sourcing's a huge piece of it, and actually talking about how there might not be quite as much data around inclusion, but then you have platforms like TextEO, right? That's addressing the idea of how your culture is really broadcast to the world and in the writing of the job requisitions that you write.
Absolutely. And I'm obviously a huge fan of TextEO. So Atlassian was one of their first customers, actually. Great. And the reason I'm so excited about technologies like TextEO or these sort of real-time feedback or interruptive technologies, of which there's a big school of them, is because it's not only meeting the immediate need. In the case of TextEO, it helps us attract and hire a more qualified and more diverse candidate set. It's also that it's upskilling my recruiters and my hiring community along the way. So they're getting real-time feedback on their job ads. So TextEO is an augmented natural language processing backed writing platform that provides feedback on the language in our job ads. And what I see is that for our recruiters and for our interviewers and hiring managers, that they become more aware of the impact that their language has on their environment, on the outcomes they're seeking. So it's not only helping us fix that short-term hiring piece, but it's making our folks more conscious of the words they use, which means it's actually helping us build an inclusive culture, even though that might not be exactly what you think you're buying when you get it. So it's kind of an extra benefit of solutions like that.
Right. I love that. It crosses so many chasms. That's something that we're always doing when you look at job descriptions too. That was a big one for us this year, where we really reviewed all of our job descriptions. And while I thought that they were very inclusive, you also want to make sure that you're excluding language from those. I know particularly you'll see in sales job descriptions, we're looking for an athlete.
Or a rock star.
Exactly. But it's really interesting how, those types of things can, either impact or impede your success in, trying to build an organization that's not, one size fits all.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things, getting back to sort of this value of technology, is that it can surface things that are far below even the most thoughtful and sort of attentive person. So in the case of TextEO, you talked about rock star as sort of this word that is really strongly male gendered, right? But one of my favorite examples here, and this comes from Kieran Snyder, who's the CEO of TextEO, she talks about the fact that in your job, when you write about managing a team, you're going to attract more male applicants. When you talk about developing a team, you're going to attract more female applicants.
Wow.
And when you talk about leading a team, you get a gender balanced set of applicants. And I think every manager would argue that they manage, lead, and develop their teams. There's incredibly subtle language differences that are also changing over time and sensitive to geography. Those types of things no one person could ever know, but that technological platform provides a way to get that information in real time. And so that's why I think it's special, is really focusing on the special value add that computers can give us. So it's sort of this hybrid approach.
Yeah, we've been talking about this so much as AI has continuously come up in the past 6 months to a year beyond. And the idea that everyone's fear of computers taking jobs is misinformed, because computers and AI and that entire movement is best when it is balanced with a human input, right? With that emotional connection, with that human perspective, and things like you just mentioned, right? TextEO being able to surface some things that you might not even catch on to, but then having that human element of actually still interacting with that individual is what really sets this kind of apart and makes sure we're going in the right direction.
Absolutely. It's really not an either or, it's a both and making sure that we're sort of utilizing this idea of comparative advantage, right? There are things that computers are just better at, give them those jobs. And then there are things that, humans are especially suited for, at least for the time being.
What a caveat, little asterisk there.
Whoops. Well, Aubrey, you've been so generous with your time, and there are so many other things that I would love to talk with you about. But I also want to be respectful and give you your time back, and hopefully maybe we can do this again sometime soon. But so in closing, I think I'm going to ask you sort of for your wish list, right? So if there was one thing, just one thing that you could change about how organizations hire and recruit talent, what would it be?
I think it's actually that they think about hiring individuals. So what you see is the research tells us that when we evaluate people, individually, we actually tend to rely more on stereotypes to assess their talent. But fundamentally, no company hires individuals, and there's empirically no test to determine who the quote objective best person is. And so I'd love to see a shift again for people to start thinking about how do you build a balanced team in terms of skill sets, demographics, things like that. Because what I've seen, and it's sort of how we try to approach things at Atlassian, is it opens you up to sort of non-traditional talent who ends up being an additional value add to the team, not only because they bring in that new perspective, but because that new perspective ends up amplifying the work of the people around them, and the people already on the team do that for the new joiner. And so I think if we start really thinking about teams, which is where the future of business is going, businesses who do that really well will begin to have a competitive advantage.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
That was impressive.
Absolutely.
Aubrey, please come back again, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.